Ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to Buckingham Palace today, to congratulate and thank all of you who've participated.
Christmas 2025 was meant to be peaceful. Instead, it exposed a secret that shattered the palace. While Catherine battled private health struggles, proof emerged that Camilla had quietly taken her work and power. The discovery stunned everyone and changed everything forever. Trust collapsed and the future suddenly felt uncertain. Will Catherine finally fight back? Stay tuned to find out. The morning everything shattered. At precisely 6:43 on the morning of December 25, 2025, while frost still clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle and most of Britain slept peacefully through the Christmas dawn, a single encrypted message arrived on Prince William's secure phone. The words were brief, clinical, devastating. Catherine has been informed. She knows everything. For a moment, William stared at the screen, his breath visible in the cold air of his private study. Then the weight of what those 7 words meant settled over him like ice. Across the palace grounds inside Adelaide Cottage, Catherine sat motionless in the pale winter light, a folder open before her on the breakfast table. Her hands rested flat against the polished wood, fingers spread as if steadying herself against an earthquake only she could feel. The documents inside that folder, delivered just 30 minutes earlier by a trusted aide whose face had been pale with distress, contained evidence of something she had suspected but never wanted to believe. Queen Camilla had been working methodically, deliberately, and in complete secrecy to undermine Catherine's position within the monarchy. Not through public statements or media manipulation, but through something far more insidious. A quiet, careful restructuring of ceremonial influence, charitable patronages, and internal palace hierarchies, all designed to diminish Catherine's role while elevating Camilla's own legacy. The discovery hit Catherine with a force that surprised even her. She had survived years of tabloid cruelty, navigated the complexities of royal protocol, endured health challenges that would have broken others, and emerged each time with grace intact. But this was different. This wasn't an attack from outside the institution. This was betrayal from within, from a woman she had shown respect, even warmth, during some of the most difficult transitions the monarchy had faced. And now, while Catherine had been quietly recovering from her own health struggles earlier in the year, Camilla had moved like a shadow through the palace machinery, repositioning herself as the central maternal figure of the royal family, subtly erasing Catherine's carefully built charitable legacy, and worst of all, attempting to influence the future roles of George, Charlotte, and Louis in ways that bypassed their parents entirely. Outside Kensington Palace, the world continued its Christmas morning rituals, unaware that inside the heart of the British monarchy, a crisis was unfolding that would reshape the institution's internal power structure for years to come. Staff members who had served the royal household for decades moved through the corridors with unusual tension, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes betraying the knowledge that something monumental had shifted. By 7:15, news of Catherine's discovery had reached Princess Anne at Gatcombe Park. She set down her morning tea with a firmness that rattled the saucer and said to no one in particular, "It's finally happened." Anne had been warning about this for months, watching Camilla's growing assertiveness with the wary eye of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting royal protocol. The reaction was immediate and seismic. William, already dressed despite the early hour, made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The first to Anne, confirming what she already suspected. The second to his private secretary, instructing immediate lockdown of all communications regarding Catherine's health and schedule. The third to a senior constitutional advisor, requesting an emergency review of palace governance structures. His voice remained calm throughout each conversation, but those who knew him well would have recognized the steel beneath the composure. This was William in protection mode, the future king responding to a threat against his wife and, by extension, against the stability of the succession itself. Inside Clarence House, King Charles woke to the news with a sinking sensation he had felt too many times before. The palace machinery, that intricate web of protocol, personnel, and politics, was about to churn into crisis mode once again. And this time, the conflict sat directly in his own household, between the woman he had waited decades to marry and the woman who would one day be queen consort to his son. Charles understood immediately the impossible position he now occupied. But what troubled him most was the realization that Camilla had done this knowingly, deliberately, during a period when Catherine was at her most vulnerable. By 8 o'clock on Christmas morning, the palace had entered what senior staff would later describe as controlled chaos. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, the monarchy was bracing for an internal reckoning that could not be postponed, smoothed over, or quietly resolved. Because Catherine, having seen the evidence, having understood the depth and duration of Camilla's maneuvering, had made a decision. She would not remain silent. She would not absorb this betrayal with the passive grace expected of royal women. And most significantly, she had the support of the two people whose voices mattered most. William, who would defend his wife with the full weight of his future authority, and Anne, who would defend the integrity of royal protocol with the unwavering discipline of a lifetime service. The morning Britain woke to celebrate Christmas was the morning the palace's fragile equilibrium finally shattered. The shadows gather. To understand how the crisis of December 25th erupted with such force, we must step back into the quieter, more unsettling months that preceded it. Months when the warning signs were subtle but accumulating, when small irregularities began forming patterns, and when those closest to Catherine started noticing changes they couldn't quite name but deeply felt. The unraveling had actually begun much earlier, during the long private autumn, when Catherine was recovering from her health challenges, largely away from public view. The palace had been careful with messaging, releasing minimal information while Catherine focused on her treatment and gradual return to wellness. But inside the palace walls, Catherine's temporary withdrawal from public duties created a vacuum, and Camilla, whether consciously or instinctively, began to fill it. At first, the shifts seemed reasonable, even thoughtful. Camilla stepped in to cover several of Catherine's scheduled patronage visits. She increased her public visibility at charitable events. Palace communications framed this as the royal family supporting one another during a difficult period. But those who worked closely within the system began noticing something else. Camilla wasn't simply covering Catherine's duties. She was reshaping them. A visit to a children's hospital that Catherine had championed for years was reframed in press releases as part of Camilla's long-standing commitment to health initiatives. A literacy program Catherine had launched was subtly absorbed into Camilla's reading room project. These weren't accidents. They were careful, deliberate editorial choices that gradually shifted public perception. Princess Anne noticed first. She had been reviewing autumn scheduling documents when she paused over a peculiar detail. A patronage handover protocol had been expedited through a channel connected to Camilla's private office, bypassing the standard process. Anne, who had spent her entire life respecting the invisible architecture of royal procedure, felt a familiar prickle of alarm. What she saw over the following weeks confirmed her concerns. Camilla's office was functioning almost independently, making decisions that traditionally required broader consultation, adjusting ceremonial orders without proper clearance, and most troublingly, communicating directly with certain charitable organizations in ways that created confusion about which royal held which patronage. Inside Kensington Palace, aides who had worked with Catherine for years found themselves shut out of communications they once managed. Requests for information about upcoming events were redirected to Buckingham Palace. Charitable partnerships Catherine had nurtured personally were now being handled by Camilla's team, with Catherine's office informed only as a courtesy, if at all. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Camilla's influence was expanding and Catherine's was contracting. William sensed the shift before anyone told him directly. He noticed the way briefing documents arriving at Kensington Palace had changed in tone, the way Catherine's name appeared less frequently in forward planning materials. When he raised concerns during a November meeting with senior household staff, the uncomfortable silence that followed told him everything. The most damaging evidence emerged unexpectedly during a routine archival review. A junior staff member noticed discrepancies in recent documentation. Several charitable organizations listed Catherine as their patron in internal files but credited Camilla in public-facing materials. The changes had been authorized through a memorandum issued by Camilla's private secretary, a memorandum that bypassed the traditional approval process and carried an instruction that the adjustments were to be implemented quietly during the princess's recovery. Perhaps the most chilling detail came from an unexpected source. A former lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth reached out privately to Princess Anne with a warning. Camilla had been consulting with advisors about ensuring the Queen Consort's legacy remained central even as the next generation ascended, including discussions about repositioning Catherine's public role to focus exclusively on her children. Anne brought this information to William on December 15th. She presented the facts, the documentation, the testimonies from trusted sources, and the pattern they formed. William listened in complete silence. When Anne finished, he asked only one question. "Does Catherine know?" "Not yet," Anne replied, "but she will need to." The decision was made that Catherine would be informed after Christmas. But on the morning of December 23rd, a confidential briefing document intended for William's review was mistakenly included in a broader circulation. Catherine, reviewing materials for an upcoming engagement, opened the file and found herself staring at a comprehensive analysis of Camilla's strategic maneuvering over the past 6 months. Every patronage redirected, every ceremonial adjustment, every quiet conversation with organizations that had once been Catherine's alone. Catherine read the entire document in silence, her face expressionless, her hands steady. When she finished, she closed the folder and walked to the window overlooking the winter gardens. For a long time, she simply stood there, watching the frost glitter in the pale December light. She did not cry, she did not rage, but something inside her finally reached its limit. By the time William returned home that evening, Catherine had made her decision. She would not wait until after Christmas. The palace was about to face the consequences of what Camilla had done. The evidence unfolds. The discovery that Catherine made on December 23rd did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a cascade of carefully documented transgressions, each one small enough to dismiss individually but together forming an unmistakable pattern of calculated undermining. The briefing document that landed in her hands that morning was not a hasty compilation thrown together by anxious staff. It was a methodical forensic analysis prepared over weeks by trusted advisors who had grown increasingly alarmed by what they were witnessing. The file, marked confidential and intended solely for William's review, contained 47 pages of evidence. Each page represented another thread in a web Camilla had been weaving since early autumn, during the exact period when Catherine was at her most vulnerable. Catherine sat at her desk in the private study at Adelaide Cottage, the winter morning light casting long shadows across the room, and read every single page. She moved through the document with the same disciplined focus she brought to every aspect of her royal duties, pausing occasionally to reread a section, to absorb the full implications of what was being described. The first section detailed patronage redirections. Between September and early December, 7 charitable organizations that had been under Catherine's direct patronage for years had received communications from Camilla's office suggesting a transition of primary royal support. The language used was careful, framed as a temporary arrangement during Catherine's recovery period, but the subtext was clear. Camilla was positioning herself as the more reliable, more present, more engaged royal partner. And critically, none of these communications had been coordinated with Catherine's office or approved through the proper palace channels. The second section was even more troubling. It documented changes to ceremonial protocols that had been implemented without the traditional consultation process. At 3 separate state functions between October and November, the seating arrangements, processional orders, and official photographs had been adjusted to elevate Camilla's prominence while minimizing Catherine's visibility. In one particularly striking example, a remembrance service that traditionally featured the Princess of Wales in a central ceremonial role had been restructured to place Camilla at the focal point, with Catherine repositioned to a secondary location that diminished her constitutional importance. The changes were subtle enough that casual observers might not notice, but to anyone who understood royal protocol, they represented a deliberate distortion of the hierarchy that governs the monarchy's public presentation. The third section examined internal communications, and this was where the evidence became most damaging. Through a careful review of email traffic, meeting minutes, and staff testimonies, the document revealed that Camilla had been holding private strategy sessions with a small circle of advisors, sessions that were not recorded in official palace schedules and were deliberately kept separate from the coordinated planning that normally governed royal activities. The topics discussed in these meetings included long-term positioning of the Queen Consort's legacy, strategies for maintaining public relevance as the younger generation gained prominence, and specific approaches for absorbing Catherine's charitable initiatives into Camilla's expanding portfolio. One particularly cold phrase appeared in notes from an October meeting. The goal was to ensure that when the public thinks of the monarchy's compassionate face, they see the Queen Consort first and the Princess of Wales as a supporting figure. Catherine felt something tighten in her chest as she read that line. It wasn't the ambition itself that stung, it was the timing. Camilla had launched this repositioning campaign precisely when Catherine was fighting private health battles, when her energy was devoted to recovery and to shielding her children from unnecessary worry. The betrayal wasn't just strategic, it was opportunistic, exploiting vulnerability for institutional gain. The fourth section detailed something even more unsettling. Camilla's office had begun reaching out directly to certain members of the media, particularly journalists known for their sympathetic coverage of the Queen Consort, with carefully framed narratives about the future structure of the monarchy. These conversations suggested that as King Charles aged, the institutional memory and ceremonial expertise of the Queen Consort would become increasingly vital, potentially creating a lasting advisory role that extended into William's reign. Camilla was attempting to secure a permanent position of influence that would survive the transition of power. William had discovered this section just days before Catherine saw the full document. His reaction was immediate and ice-cold. He understood instantly what Camilla was attempting. She was trying to create a structure where her influence persisted regardless of who wore the crown, where her legacy became so intertwined with the institution's functioning that removing her voice would seem destabilizing. It was a strategy that ignored a fundamental truth. The monarchy's survival depended on clear lines of succession and unambiguous authority. The final section was perhaps the most personally painful for Catherine. It outlined instances where Camilla had made decisions regarding public messaging about George, Charlotte, and Louis without consulting their parents. At one charity event, Camilla had spoken publicly about preparing the next generation for their roles, using language that suggested she saw herself as a guiding force in that preparation. These were small moments, easily dismissed as natural grandmotherly warmth, but in the context of everything else, they were part of a larger pattern of Camilla inserting herself into spaces where protocol suggested she should wait for invitation. Catherine closed the document and sat in silence for a long time. She thought about the years she had spent carefully building her role within the monarchy, the patronages she had chosen with such care, the initiatives she had nurtured from concept to reality. And she thought about how quickly all of that could be erased through quiet, bureaucratic maneuvering by someone who understood the system well enough to manipulate it. But what troubled Catherine most was the realization that Camilla had done all of this while presenting a face of support and concern. The Queen Consort had visited during Catherine's recovery, had sent thoughtful messages, and had spoken publicly about family unity, all of it genuine in appearance, and all of it running parallel to a calculated campaign to diminish her institutional standing. By the time William returned home that evening, Catherine had made several decisions. She would not confront Camilla privately. She would not wait for the palace machinery to determine the appropriate response on a timeline convenient to institutional comfort. And she would not allow this matter to be resolved through quiet adjustments that swept the betrayal under diplomatic phrasing. The evidence was clear, the pattern was undeniable, and the consequences would need to be institutional, not personal. The palace divides. The 48 hours following Catherine's discovery transformed Buckingham Palace from a coordinated institution into a house divided, with loyalties splitting along lines that reflected not just personal allegiances, but fundamental disagreements about what the monarchy needed to survive its current crisis. By the morning of December 24th, 3 separate power centers had formed, each operating with its own analysis of the situation, its own priorities, and its own vision of how the conflict should be resolved. The divisions were not loud or dramatic. Royal crises rarely are. But they were absolute, and they made the traditional Christmas preparations feel like stage management for a family that had ceased to function as a unified whole. The first center of gravity formed around William and Catherine at Kensington Palace. Their response to the crisis was shaped by a combination of personal hurt and strategic calculation. Catherine, having absorbed the full scope of Camilla's maneuvering, had moved through shock into a cold, clear-eyed determination that this could not be quietly managed. William, protective of his wife and deeply troubled by the constitutional implications, recognized that the crisis touched something more fundamental than personal rivalry. It revealed a structural problem in how power and influence were distributed within the monarchy during a period of transition. The couple spent Christmas Eve in near constant consultation with trusted advisors, reviewing not just the evidence but the broader patterns it revealed about palace governance. Their conclusion was stark. Camilla had been allowed to operate with too much autonomy, too little oversight, and too much deference to her position as queen consort. Princess Anne represented the second center of gravity, and her position was perhaps the most uncompromising. She had built her entire life around the principle that the monarchy survived through discipline. That protocol existed as the structural framework that prevented exactly this kind of internal chaos. From her perspective, the crisis was not complicated. Camilla had violated protocol repeatedly and deliberately. The evidence was documented. The consequences should be clear and swift. Anne had little patience for the emotional dimensions, the family bonds, the personal histories that made simple solutions difficult. Her view was institutional. The crown could not function if individuals were allowed to circumvent established processes for personal strategic gain. Anne had already drafted a memorandum outlining the specific protocol violations and recommending immediate restrictions on Camilla's autonomous decision-making authority. William presented the facts without emotion, but with absolute clarity. Camilla had overstepped, had violated trust, and had damaged institutional cohesion. Charles listened, asked careful questions, and requested time to review the documentation himself. What he found troubled him more than he had expected. He had known Camilla was assertive, but seeing the calculated nature of her recent actions, the systematic way she had exploited Catherine's absence, forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His wife had allowed ambition to override judgment, yet Charles also felt the weight of personal loyalty. Camilla had stood beside him through dark periods. She had endured public vilification and had rebuilt her reputation through patient service. To confront her now felt like betrayal, but to ignore the evidence would be a betrayal of William, Catherine, and the institution's future. The most painful moment came when Charles raised the issue of timing. Why had so much repositioning occurred specifically during Catherine's health challenges? Camilla had no good answer. By Christmas morning, the palace had fractured into camps that reflected deeper tensions about the monarchy's direction. William and Catherine represented the future, demanding transparency and accountability. The most striking symbol of the division came in a schedule conflict. William's office requested an emergency meeting of senior royals. Camilla's office responded that the queen consort had prior commitments and could not adjust her schedule. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Camilla was not going to present herself as the accused party. Anne's response was immediate. She contacted Charles directly and made clear that if Camilla would not participate in a coordinated response, then the palace should proceed without her input and prepare a formal statement addressing the protocol violations. As Christmas Day unfolded, with traditional appearances still required and public expectations still demanding royal unity, Those inside the palace understood the real drama was only beginning. The evidence was compiled, the divisions were clear, the storm breaks. By the morning of December 26th, the carefully maintained facade of Christmas unity had dissolved entirely, replaced by a tension so palpable that even the most junior palace staff could feel it pressing against the ancient stone walls. The traditional Boxing Day routines, normally a gentle exhale after the ceremonial intensity of Christmas, had been abandoned in favor of emergency protocols that transformed Buckingham Palace into something resembling a crisis command center. Senior advisors moved through corridors with unusual urgency, their faces set in expressions of professional neutrality that barely concealed the alarm beneath. Outside the palace gates, the world remained blissfully unaware of the internal earthquake taking place, but inside, everyone understood that the countdown to public revelation had begun. The fracture became irreversible when word spread through the household staff that Catherine had requested a formal meeting with the Lord Chamberlain, a step so unusual and so constitutionally significant that it could only mean one thing. The Princess of Wales was no longer willing to allow this matter to be resolved through private family discussions or gentle institutional adjustments. She was invoking official channels, demanding that the evidence against Camilla be reviewed through proper palace governance structures, and making clear that she expected institutional consequences, not personal apologies. For a woman known for her diplomatic restraint and her careful navigation of royal protocol, this was an extraordinary escalation. It signaled that Catherine had reached a conclusion many had suspected, but few had seen her embrace so completely. Sometimes protecting the institution required confronting those within it, regardless of rank, regardless of relationship, regardless of the emotional cost. The staff reaction split along lines that revealed deeper allegiances within the palace ecosystem. Those who had worked closely with Catherine for years, who had watched her build her role with patience and precision, felt a surge of vindication. They had witnessed the small slights, the gradual erosion of her authority during her absence, the way Camilla's office had begun operating as though Catherine's patronages were interchangeable resources rather than carefully cultivated partnerships. Now, finally, someone was speaking up. But others, particularly those who had served under Camilla, or who remembered the brutal years when she was vilified by press and public alike, felt a more complicated mixture of sympathy and concern. They worried that the monarchy was repeating old patterns, that once again a woman was being positioned as the problem, rather than addressing the structural issues that allowed power imbalances to develop in the first place. The international reaction, though still unofficial and based on carefully placed leaks rather than formal announcements, began forming along predictable lines. In Britain, particularly among viewers over 50 who remembered the Diana era with painful clarity, the emerging story triggered immediate comparisons. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation about history repeating itself, about whether the monarchy had learned anything from past failures, about whether Catherine would be protected in ways Diana never was. The tone was protective, fiercely defensive of Catherine, and increasingly critical of Camilla. Phrases like manipulative and power-hungry began appearing in comment sections, not from fringe conspiracy theorists, but from ordinary people who felt the institution had once again failed to safeguard a beloved princess. The parallel to Diana was unavoidable, and palace communication staff watched with growing alarm as the narrative began tilting toward a story they could not control. Inside Kensington Palace, William faced a decision that carried implications far beyond this immediate crisis. He could continue pushing for institutional accountability, supporting Catherine's demand for formal consequences and risking a permanent breach with his father and Camilla. Or he could accept a quieter resolution, one that preserved family relationships but left the structural problems unaddressed and potentially allowed similar patterns to emerge again in the future. His choice, made after hours of consultation with Catherine and with Anne's unflinching support, was decisive. The institution came first. The crown's integrity could not be sacrificed to preserve personal comfort. If that meant a public reckoning that exposed internal dysfunction, then so be it. The alternative, continued tolerance of behavior that undermined the clear lines of authority the monarchy needed to function, was simply unsustainable. Anne's position throughout this escalating crisis remained characteristically absolute. She had spent her entire life watching the monarchy bend and compromise, absorbing scandals and managing crises through strategic silence and careful public relations. But this moment felt different to her. This was not a scandal imposed from outside, not a tabloid invention or a public relations disaster born of careless comments. This was internal sabotage, a deliberate undermining of institutional structure by someone who should have known better, who should have understood that the monarchy's survival depended on respecting the hierarchies and protocols that gave it coherence. Anne made her position clear in a terse memorandum circulated to senior household staff. Consequences must be proportional to violations. Anything less invites repetition. It was the closest she came to publicly criticizing Camilla, and everyone who read it understood exactly what she meant. The most painful dimension of the crisis, the one that haunted the private conversations and weighed most heavily on those trying to navigate a resolution, was the position of King Charles. He had spent the days since Christmas Eve in a state of visible anguish, caught between competing loyalties that no amount of constitutional duty could fully reconcile. His love for Camilla was genuine, earned through decades of partnership and mutual support. His responsibility to William and to the crown's future was equally genuine, rooted in the understanding that his reign was always meant to be a bridge to the next generation. Now he was being forced to choose, not dramatically or absolutely, but in ways that would signal where his ultimate loyalty resided. Every decision he made, every statement he authorized, every meeting he attended or avoided would be interpreted as taking a side, and taking a side meant betraying someone he cared about. By December 27th, the internal pressure had reached a critical threshold. Leaked reports began appearing in British newspapers, carefully worded to avoid direct accusations but clear enough in their implications. Inside Camilla's private quarters, the Queen Consort faced the dawning realization that her position, so hard-won and so recently secure, had become suddenly precarious. The evidence against her was documented, the support for Catherine was solidifying, and even Charles, despite his personal loyalty, could not ignore the institutional implications of what she had done. Her advisors, the small circle who had helped plan the strategies now being exposed as overreach, found themselves unable to offer solutions beyond damage control. The time for maneuvering had passed. What remained was the consequences, and for a woman who had spent decades clawing her way from public villain to respected queen consort, the prospect of institutional rebuke felt like a return to the darkest years of her life, when every mistake was amplified and every stumble became evidence of her unworthiness. The reckoning arrives. The decision to issue a formal palace statement came not as a dramatic moment of resolution, but as an exhausted acknowledgement that the crisis could no longer be managed through private channels or institutional diplomacy. By the morning of December 28th, senior advisors from across the royal households had gathered in the 1844 room at Buckingham Palace, the same ornate space where countless delicate negotiations had taken place over generations. But this meeting carried a weight that transcended typical royal business. The statement they were drafting would either restore institutional clarity or permanently fracture the fragile unity Charles had worked so hard to establish since his coronation. Every word mattered. Every implication would be analyzed, and everyone in the room understood that once the statement went public, there would be no walking it back. William attended the meeting with a composure that masked the exhaustion beneath. He had spent the previous night reviewing multiple drafts, each attempting to balance institutional accountability with family sensitivity, each struggling to name the problem without destroying relationships beyond repair. His primary concern was protecting Catherine from becoming collateral damage in a story that would inevitably be framed as a catfight between royal women, the lazy narrative that had destroyed Diana and nearly destroyed Camilla herself decades earlier. The statement needed to be clear that this was not about personality conflicts or jealousy. It was about governance, about protocol violations, about the structural integrity of an institution that could not function if individuals operated outside established channels for personal strategic gain. That distinction, William insisted repeatedly, had to be preserved in the language. The monarchy either had rules that mattered or it did not. And if rules mattered, then violations had consequences, regardless of who committed them. King Charles entered the meeting late, looking older than his years, the strain of the past week visible in the tightness around his eyes and the heaviness in his movements. He took his seat at the head of the table and listened as the current draft was read aloud. The language had been softened considerably from Anne's version, reframed as a clarification of roles and responsibilities, rather than an accusation of wrongdoing. It acknowledged recent confusion regarding patronage management and ceremonial protocols, confirmed that steps were being taken to ensure better coordination across royal households, and emphasized the importance of clear communication channels during periods of transition. It was diplomatic, institutional, and almost entirely toothless. Charles listened to the end, then asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Does this statement actually address what happened, or does it simply paper over the problem? The room fell silent, because everyone knew the answer. The diplomatic version protected Camilla's dignity, but left the fundamental issues unresolved. The turning point came when a senior constitutional advisor, a man who had served the crown for 40 years and who rarely spoke in these meetings, offered an observation that cut through the careful diplomatic language. The statement we release will be remembered not for what it says, but for what it reveals about whether this institution can hold its own members accountable. If we cannot do that, if we prioritize personal comfort over structural integrity, then we are not building a monarchy for the next generation. We are managing the decline of the current one. The final version of the statement, drafted over the next 3 hours with input from legal advisors, communications experts, and constitutional historians, represented a painful compromise. It acknowledged that recent months had revealed inconsistencies in how patronages and ceremonial roles were managed across senior royal households. It confirmed that a comprehensive review of palace governance structures was underway to ensure better coordination and clearer lines of authority. It emphasized that all members of the royal family, regardless of position, were expected to operate within established protocols and consultation processes. And critically, it announced that Queen Camilla's office would be restructured to ensure closer integration with the broader palace coordination systems, a bureaucratic phrase that translated into a clear loss of autonomous authority. The statement did not name Camilla as having done anything wrong, but it did not need to. Anyone reading between the lines would understand that the Queen Consort had been reined in. Camilla was informed of the statement's contents 2 hours before it was scheduled for release. Charles delivered the news personally, a conversation that took place behind closed doors and about which no details were ever publicly shared. But staff who saw Camilla afterward reported that she appeared composed but shaken, her usual confidence replaced by something harder to read. She understood what the statement meant. Her influence had been curtailed, her autonomy had been revoked, and her position, while technically unchanged, had been diminished in ways that would be visible to anyone who understood palace dynamics. For a woman who had fought so hard to establish legitimacy and respect, the institutional rebuke felt like a return to the years when she was tolerated but never truly welcomed. The difference now was that the rebuke came not from hostile press or resentful public, but from the institution itself. Catherine's response to the finalized statement was quietly relieved. It was not everything she might have wanted. It did not include the explicit acknowledgement of harm that part of her believed was warranted, but it achieved the essential goal. It established that what Camilla had done was unacceptable, that protocols existed for reasons that applied to everyone, and that the institution was willing to impose consequences when those protocols were violated. Most importantly, it protected the future. The restructuring of Camilla's office and the emphasis on integrated coordination meant that the patterns of the past months could not easily repeat. William, who had worked most closely with Catherine throughout the crisis, felt a similar mixture of relief and exhaustion. The battle had been won, but the cost, measured in family relationships, strained perhaps beyond repair, weighed heavily. The immediate reaction was cautious, with most commentators recognizing that the carefully diplomatic language concealed a more significant story. But by midday, as royal correspondents consulted with palace sources and pieced together the context, the real narrative began emerging. The BBC ran a segment titled "Palace Moves to Address Internal Tensions." Sky News described it as a rare public acknowledgement of royal household dysfunction. In the United States, CNN framed it as "King Charles reins in Queen Camilla," a headline that was more direct than British coverage but not inaccurate. The international response split predictably. British audiences over 50 expressed satisfaction that the institution had taken action, viewing it as evidence that the monarchy could still police itself. American viewers expressed more skepticism, questioning whether the changes were substantive or merely cosmetic. Inside the palace, the hours following the statement's release brought a strange calm, the kind that settles after a storm has passed, but before the full damage can be assessed. Staff moved through their duties with subdued efficiency, aware that they had witnessed a historic moment but uncertain what it meant for the future. William and Catherine returned to their private life at Adelaide Cottage, focusing on their children and trying to restore some semblance of normalcy after days of crisis.